Can you all see me comfortably from where you are? Good. I am so grateful to be with you. I am grateful to be here with Bishop Hisu and Reverend M, who have been friends of my soul for a long time. And I am delighted to be in Ohio. I must tell you, this is a little bit like a pilgrimage for me because I've never been in Columbus that I remember. But my mother was from Scotland and my father was Native American, which meant that we had to occasionally go to Highland festivals when I was being raised, and my mom would make my dad a kilt, and he looked like a Native American in drag. But the pilgrimage part of today for me is that my parents met at Ohio State University, where they both attended. My mother coming from Scotland, my father coming from South Dakota on an athletic scholarship in the late 40s after the Korean War. And they met here. My father was running around an area of campus and ran into my mother, who was a music major, and knocked her down, and that's how they met. My father said that my mother saw a very handsome Native American man and decided that she should marry him. And Mom said that for 40 years she thought he was Italian and just didn't know the difference. But the interesting part also in preparing for this trip, in order for my father, who came from a reservation in South Dakota, in order for him to arrive and be able to accept the scholarship, he needed to take the last half of his senior year, where the credits were not always the same on a native reservation, and he needed to attend high school here. So he spent the last half year of high school at Worthington High School, and in going through, yes, it's almost like heaven. And I found among his things his letterman, his letters, and I had intended to be the ones that went on his sweater. So for most of my dad's life, he thought that Woody Hayes was the fourth person of the Trinity. And he just really didn't know any better. But there was a deep love for my parents, for this town, and for the university, and for all that they gave him. Two people from very distinct parts of the world and very different cultures met here and began their life. They were married here and began their life together. So having never been here, this walking on Ohio ground feels very good to my feet. My father had a Buckeye. It's very hard to explain to people what a Buckeye is. There's the chocolate ones, the peanut butter dipped in chocolate, and then they are the real ones for the tree. I took my dad's to show and tell, and then I lost it by mistake. He'd always kept it in his top drawer, and there was a sense of mourning about the Buckeye. But he also had an Ohio State cap that he wore. When he passed away, the Ohio State cap came to me. Actually, we shared it, passed it from one person to another. And when I went to Michigan for the first time, I accidentally wore the Ohio State cap. And I believe that there were people with bricks lining up outside my hotel room. But thank you for the hospitality in being here with you. the celebration of community and the celebration of faith is a great gift. I come from a culture that celebrates community more than anything else in the world. In Lakota, I cannot even use my language without pulling people into relationship. I cannot even say hello to you without finding a way that you fit me in relationship. So if I say to you, hello, and I really have to struggle and you see me pause, in the language I'm finding a way to pull you into relationship, because there is no way that I can even say hello to you without finding a place in which you fit into my life. So if you are a friend or somebody that I am meeting as a friend, I would say how kola, how being hello or greetings, kola, K-O-L-A, meaning friend. If we were talking to each other today and we were carrying on a conversation, if you were my age, I would call you brother or sister. If you were older, it might be parent. I might use the word for mother or father, and even though I am 70, in just a few weeks, if you're older than me, I would call you grandmother or grandfather. I was in Denver riding a bus to the Denver March powwow. There was an elderly Native American man standing in the snow waiting to catch the bus. And he was looking around and he was lost. The bus driver kept trying to ask him where it was he wanted to go, and he just looked confused. So remembering my protocol, not knowing what tribe he was from, I just stepped off the bus for a little bit and I looked at him and I said, "Grandfather, where is it that we need to go together?" Because to send him on his way alone would have been a negative thing in my culture. You do not refer to somebody as an individual where they are a stranger, but you refer to person in relationship. So once I say to him, grandfather, even though he is not the grandfather of my birth, he becomes my grandfather for that moment. And once he is my grandfather, I can never say to him, "Where is it that you want to go?" I have to say to him, "Where is it that you and I together are needing to go?" And so in that very moment, even though not knowing him, he responds to me as if I am his grandson, and I respond to him as if he is my grandfather. That means in our culture, Lakota as well as Tlingit cultures, but immediately when I see you, I think, what relationship will this person become to me? We used to go to visit churches, and we would go up into the Black Hills and sometimes visit the churches when we heard that there were special services. My father had a red Chevy pickup. He would never drive a Ford. My grandfather wouldn't even keep a $20 bill, not that he had many of them. He wouldn't even keep one in his wallet because President Jackson's picture was on it. And as you know from history, President Jackson was the president when the Supreme Court said you cannot take away the Cherokee and Choctaw and Chickasaw, the 5 civilized tribes we called them. When you cannot take away their land, President Andrew Jackson said, "Let the Supreme Court try to stop me." And so he removed them and made them walk on 5 different trails of tears. They were called trails of tears not because people wept, but because in Nashville, when they walked through the city of Nashville, people lined where they were walking and they wept. And so among Native people, It is the trail where those watching wept. And their pastors, many of them Baptists and many of them Methodists, many of their pastors walked the trail of tears with them, all the way from Georgia and the Carolinas to Oklahoma. And there are monuments to the Methodist clergy who went with their congregations on the Trail of Tears. In the middle of all this, my grandfather said, if his picture is on this $20 bill, I do not need to get wealthy. I will keep in my pocket the things that are positive and cause me and call me to move to forgiveness and the good things. But he wouldn't hesitate at all if he had one with Benjamin Franklin. My grandmother and my father and I had gone up into the Black Hills. We'd gone to a church service. Very often, and you'll forgive me, but sometimes coming back, I would sit in the back of the pickup truck, and many of you are from rural communities, and so where we lived, you could drive a tractor at age 10, and you could drive farm trucks on your property at about the same age. But I sat in the back of the pickup truck, and my grandmother and my grandfather in the front, and there was no window in the back. That's so the dogs could get in and out in case it snowed. I once asked my father, how do you know if someone is a Christian? And my dad said, ask his dog. My father was saying, not just for the warmth of loving a pet, but if you want to know that a person's life is open to the love of God, ask the most vulnerable person in their life. How does this person treat you and live their life around you? How does the person who is most subject to belief is treated by this person? We can tell each other's faith by how we treat the tokoi, or the people who are most vulnerable. We went up into the mountains, and my father and grandmother came down one night, and my father said, "You remember what the pastor said?" And I said, "I think so, Dad." And he said, "I want you to forget it. Don't remember what the pastor said." When my dad said that, there was a very good reason for it. Sometimes he said that about every pastor, and sometimes he said that about specific sermons. But it was his way of correcting cultural things or spiritual things. So on the way back, he said, "You remember when the pastor said, 'Give your best to God'?" He said, "I want you to forget that. I want you to give your worst to God." Anybody can give the things of which they are proud and any of the things that they do well, because it's an easy thing to put those things up front, isn't it? These are the things which show people who I am, and these are the things, God, that I know you're going to use. But God is the God that takes the things that we cannot or do not want other people to know. God is the God who looks at our lives and the things we would never tell anybody about ourselves. God says, take that very thing and give it to me as a gift. Native people wrap up our spiritual gifts in the color red. So my father would say, take the very worst of your life, Ray, and wrap it up in red as if it were a sacred thing, and give it to God, and let God make of the worst thing in your life whatever God can make of it. Don't just remember the good thing, but give of yourself. We were coming back down the mountain. We stopped at a gas station, and these were in the days of the late 60s. There was a sign outside of the gas station that said, "No Indians and dogs allowed." My father was brown, and my grandmother, being Tlingit or Alaskan Native, her skin looked like the color of old lemons. It was beautiful. When she was born, her parents gave her the name of Nakia, or the way ice crystals look when they're lit by the moon. So if you're ever outside and you look up and there's frost in the air, and there is around the moon a rainbow, we call that the moon of the silver fox in Alaska. My grandparents looked at this little baby girl and they said she absolutely glowed from the inside out. So the spiritual name they gave her was the way that icicles look when they're lit by the moon. We were driving back and we stopped at the gas station. 2 treats after church was a bottle of chocolate milk for me. It shows you how old I am. And chocolate milk used to be sold next to Pepsi's in the pop machine. My grandmother would get a Coca-Cola, which was a treat for her. We walked inside, my dad and I. My dad got the drinks and he set them on the counter. And he said, "I'd like to just buy these." And he took out his wallet. And the man pointed to the sign outside that said, "No Indians and dogs allowed." And he said, "We don't serve Indian people here." My dad was a big man. He was about 6'4" and very strong. I expected something monumental to happen. My dad was and still is one of the most important heroes of my life. I remember shortly at the time of his death, when my father was frail, he wanted to walk with me from one end of the hospital to the other. And he tried to walk and he couldn't stand up. And I reached down and I put my arms around my dad, my arms under his legs, and I carried him to the end of the hall and back to his room. Oh, the joy of carrying somebody who had carried me most all of his life in so many ways. But that day he stood in a gas station in South Dakota and stood to his full height. And he looked at the man just simply and he said, "Thank you very much, sir." We went back and we got into the pickup truck. And a man sitting out front picked up a rock and he threw it at the back where there wasn't a glass, but it glazed off of my left eyebrow and made a cut, and it went inside the car. We couldn't go to a regular hospital at that point in history. We had to go to a native hospital, so we drove and they put stitches in my eyebrow. But when I went home sitting as far as I could from my dad. I came in where I usually sat in the middle between my grandmother and my dad, and I squeezed up right up against the door so that there was no room for me and anything between me. And I went home and I climbed upstairs to my bedroom that I shared with one of my other brothers. I didn't say a word to my dad. My dad knew that there was a river outside of our house called the Little Walking River. My dad knew that in summer, when it got to be August, it was very trickle, but in the spring, after the rains that came, the river flowed very quickly and it spread between us. And I wanted to swim across the river and then climb up the butte on the other side. In the middle of the night, my father came up and patted my foot and said, "Come down and meet me at the truck." And I got up and I went down to the truck where my dad was. And again, I got in the car. I was going to say, as only children can do, I ignored my father, but we're all pretty good at that most all times of our lives. So I got in and I sat up against the door and I didn't say anything. And my father drove out to the banks of the little walking river and he turned the red truck around so that its lights shone out across the river. And my dad walked out and he took off his clothing. And then he said, "Raymond, come on out here. Take off your clothes." So I took off my clothes. My dad had waded out into the river. And he said, "Come on out here to where I am." And when I got there, he turned around. He took my arms and he pulled them up around his neck and he pulled my legs up around his waist. And my father began to swim. He had injured his knee while in college and so had lost his athletic scholarship. He limped on that leg, but he was very strong. He began to swim across the little walking river. Times I could feel the movements of his arms. Times I could feel the kicking of his legs. And at times the swift flowing water flowed between the two of us. So sometimes I was holding on for dear life. And then my dad got to the other side. And with my arms and legs still around his body, he began to climb up the bluff on the other side, which had always been my goal. When he got to the top, we stood looking down on the little walking river and the lights of the truck shining out across the water. And we didn't say a word to each other. And then he picked me up and put my arms around his neck and my legs around his waist. And he climbed down in the dark and the lights of the pickup truck. When he got into the water, he began to swim. And the little boy went home with his head on his dad's lap. There are so many times in our lives that we have asked God, "How big are you?" I need to get past this God and the God that is our faith and the foundation of our lives. Seems like at times God is not big enough, or God has not stood up enough, or in the middle of crises around us we say, "Where are you, God, and where is your greatness and your bigness? You are my hero, and right now I feel like I'm a little bit let down." And then God does the impossible for us. God, like God did to Abraham, says, "Get up from where you are and wade out into the water." I love that spiritual. For all of its varieties of meaning, wade into the water. And God is there. And God doesn't say, "Get up and start your swimming." God just simply pulls our arms around God's neck and God begins to swim. And there are times in our faith, folks, when we can sense the power of God, like when we are gathered as community and we know that God is in our midst. And there are times when we know that we are only holding on for dear life. So much is sweeping between us and God that all we know is we're still holding on. And then God does the more, the thing we didn't ask. And God gets to the other side, the other shore, and then begins climbing up the hill. And standing in the moonlight with God, we realize that not for forever, not for next month, not for next year, or even tomorrow, for this moment, God has met us in our point of need. And it has been the strength of God, not the show-off that we were looking for. Not the hero, not the person that is standing there so all the world can see, but at this moment in our point of need, God has met us and met our need. And then God does something more. God seems to say, this is this thing you didn't know to ask. This is the thing you were afraid to ask. And God climbs, and we look down on the lights of our feeble little truck shining across the water, and we go home with our head in the lap of God. There are strengths that the God that we thought was not big enough, or that had abandoned us or left us, the God is not present. It was just a little bit later, my grandmother came in. My grandmother was Tlingit, which means she was from Southeast Alaska. When she was 5, she was sent to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. My grandfather was taken from South Dakota. My grandmother, as I told you, her name meant the way icicles look when they're lit by the moon. She had an older sister. They are part of the only 15 Tlingit children that were taken from Alaska and sent to Carlisle. When they arrived there, they cut their hair. There's a prayer that Indian children sing from whatever tribes they are from when you brush your hair in the morning, because you grow your hair as an honor to God. I used to have a long braid down to the middle of my back. My dad taught me how to braid my hair. He would tell me that when I took a shower, to take the shampoo and pull it through the braid. Don't unbraid it. And when I got out, then my hair wouldn't be tangled. And then while I was getting it braided, he taught me how to lift it up above my head. And as it got long, I could hardly braid it anymore, but that way the braid would come out perfect. My dad would get up in the morning. One of the things he did for our family was that my father would get up at 4:30 and he would pray. He would take a shower every day, braid his hair in the morning. He would fix breakfast for all of the children, make sure that we were all getting on the right bus. But as part of his tradition, but more than that, he also celebrated his baptism by taking sweetgrass, which also grows here in Ohio. He would take a braid of sweetgrass and he would light it, and he would pull the fragrance over his hair. Now, in our culture, when you pull the fragrance over your hair, sweetgrass is pleasant to God, kind of like the incense in the Old Testament, or the incense we use in some of our Orthodox churches. But it has another spiritual meaning. And that meaning is that when I smell sweetgrass on you, I know that for this day you have set yourself apart to live in a sacred manner. If we were gathering in here, before we gathered for worship, one of our elders would come in, and not in a way that was showy, just privately, and they would burn sweetgrass or sage so that when we walked through the door, we would know that this room had been set apart for a sacred purpose. When I smell sweetgrass or sage on you, I don't engage you in gossip. I don't criticize other people around you. I don't say things that are discouraging to you. I don't do things that cause an interruption to your relationship with God for that day. So I would put my arms around my father's neck, and I would smell every day of my life that he had set himself apart for a sacred purpose. My grandmother's hair was cut. She was asked to point to a blackboard. She couldn't read the names, but they gave her the name Gladys. They gave my grandfather's, whose name meant to be speedy in wisdom, they gave to him the name Edson. The children from all different tribes couldn't speak their language. My grandmother's elder sister would come up to her while she was scrubbing the floors. That's what they taught the girls to do. Little 5-year-old girl scrubbing the dining hall with a brush, and her sister would come up and say into her ear, "Your name is not Gladys. Your spiritual name means the way ice crystals look when they're lit like the moon. You glow from the inside out." And when she passed her everywhere, she would say they weren't allowed to speak their languages. And if they did, they were beaten or put in little tiny holes in the summer in the yard. Your spiritual name is not this crisis. Your spiritual name is not the fear. Your spiritual name is not this dorm of 100 children. Your spiritual name is not what your family is going through. Your spiritual name is not the name anyone gave you, except what God tells you who you are. Your spiritual name from the inside out is this glow that radiates around you. My grandmother came to my room. I know you've probably all seen dream catchers and know what they look like, but they're a hoop, a round hoop, usually made of red willow. In the old days, the old ones, not the ones you can buy for sale today, but a very thin strip of deerskin was made that would be very long and very hard to make. And someone with a good heart, a good spirit, excuse me, would make a dream catcher, usually for a baby, and it would look like a spider web inside, because when the children were all sick, dating back to Ojibwe people, with a disease that not many survived, they had an illness, and the grandmothers went to talk to the spider. And the spider said, "If you will make a spider web inside of this hoop, and if you make it from a good heart or spiritual heart, good dreams, when they come, will know the path that a spiritual heart makes. And they will come and trickle back onto the sleeping babies. But evil will not know the path that goodness makes. So evil will become stuck in the web. And because evil cannot truly live in the light, when the first light comes, evil will vanish." My brother Rick lives with me. He's 80 years old. I want someday for you all to meet him. Someday you will. Rick has some special needs. We watch TV. He called me when I was at an academy for spiritual formation, just in turmoil over what he had seen on TV. And we talked. And he told me, he said, "Ray, I was so worried about it until I looked up at the little dream catcher, and I realized that when evil is finally shown up in the light, it cannot live." My grandmother was not her tradition, but she was a dream catcher maker. She sat down in that room. She wove a dream catcher, which she had already begun on red willow, and the deerskin was wet. She would look at me, but she wouldn't make a comment. When she wanted to say something to me, she would just look at me and point at me with her lips. She would just go. If you did something wrong, she would point her lips. It took me a while to distinguish between when she got new dentures or when I was in trouble. But we were sitting there. She took the deerskin and she tied it off until it was tight. She called me by my native name. She said, "This is God." It wasn't the story of the dream catcher. It was my grandmother's way of teaching me theology. She said, "This is God." She said, "We are all inside of God." She said, "You cannot pull God out of shape." And she tried to do this with her little hands. See, you cannot pull God out of shape because what was inside was so connected to God that it gave a spiritual tension. And she said, "See, you cannot push God out of shape." She pointed to each of the knots inside the dream catcher. She said, "This is your brother, and this is your dad, and this is the dog down the road." My grandmother believed you could get spiritual truth from the world around you. You saw the love of God in all that creation brought. And then she pointed to a knot and she said, "This is the man at the gas station." She was sitting there looking at me, and she took a pair of scissors and she reached out and she cut the dream catcher. And the dream catcher all of a sudden just unraveled into pieces, and it laid there in her lap. And my grandmother looked at me and she said, "Which knot can we do without?" Raymond, can we do without your brother? Can we do without your dad? Do we say we can do without the man down the road? Inside of us all, we live in the spiritual tension and relationship that God has brought us in together. We live in that world. We do not see too far down the dream catcher. We do not know to whom we are connected, the man at the gas station or the person down the road or our family. But we are like this. Everywhere God has connected us so that we live in relationship with each other. And can we really do without those that try to harm us? And is not our responsibility to share the hoop, the fact that God surrounds our lives and our love with even those who hurt us? In those moments that we touch the love of God. And in the name of God, we stand up and say, "Thank you very much." And we share the love of God with somebody who might not have known it. So the language enters into the picture. I look at my enemies and those with whom I am angry and those who I feel have upset my world and sometimes my church. Is it all right to say that as Christians, my grandparents became Christians, but my father became a Christian first here in Ohio. I do not reach back generations, but those of us who are second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth generations of Christian people, is it realistic to say that we live in a world where some of our biggest hurts will come not from outside of the church, but inside of the church? When the biggest spiritual struggles of our life will come where we least expect it, from people that we expect more? And then do we say somewhere on the process, Lord, if you could only move this person out. If you could only move this situation from me. But God is still there, swimming across the river. I cannot call your name without making you my relative. In Tlingit or Lakota, I cannot speak about you without making you my relative. 3 words in Lakota. It's the verb wiksaway, which means remember. The middle word is siksaway, which means I remember you. And the third word is miksaway, remember me. When I say remember in Lakota, I am not saying recall. My friend Angie will be ordained here. I met Angie not too long ago at an academy. You be quiet over there. I met Angie not too long at an academy. If I say to Angie, somebody says, do you remember, Angie? I would say, yes, I remember. If I'm talking about somebody else, I might say, I recall. Because remember does not mean that I'm calling you up in my mind, in your face, of places we were together and involved together, because you're a relative. You are a relative. But to remember means to pull you into the marrow of my bones so that I am changed from the inside out because of you. So in Lakota, if I say to you, I remember you, Siksaway, I remember you, I am different because of you. If a parent is sending a child overseas in the military or away, someone is moving away, and you have loved them and cared for them, then you use the word miksaway. When you're away from me, remember me. Remember the things of our lives that had interaction, that altered my DNA until I'm a completely different person. Because the marrow of my bones was changed because of you. We gather for the Eucharist. We come to that passage of Scripture when Jesus says, as often as you do this, remember me. Jesus is saying, miksaway. Jesus is saying that as often as you gather together as people of God, pull me into the marrow of your bones so that your life is changed. I was at an academy for the last few months. I've been trying to study in my personal life and devotions and understanding of the Hebrew concept of humility, of the 24 great Hebrew Jewish virtues. I came across the writings of the Hasidim, Martin Buber's Tales of the Hasidim. The church is the voice of God. You are the voice of God. But the church is not the only voice of God. And in reading the wisdom of the rabbis and teachers, I sometimes learn things and see things from a distinctly non-Ray Buckley point of view, which is helpful. And reading about this concept of humility, the rabbis would say to us that one of the great attributes of the person of God is that God is humble. We don't speak about the humility of God much. God is humble. We talk often, and sometimes in our contemporary worships and contemporary settings, we say, God wants our praise. God demands our praise. We need to be people full of praise. But among the Hebrew concept of the humility of God, God does not demand praise in some egotistical point of view. God wants to hear from our voice. The God who has pulled us and changed our marrow, God just wants to hear, I love you. Not some great show, not some high-tempo things. I was at the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference a while back, and we were having a wonderful time. The person who was playing piano played by ear, which is also a great gift. We sang Victory in Jesus, and about 8 times we changed keys. Till by the end of it, we were all screeching like owls in the trees. He plunged me too, and everyone would drop out because nobody could hit the victory. So we were just in a quiet discussion, and I said, folks, sometimes let's take the song Victory in Jesus. Let's sing it down where everybody can sing it. Let's not keep raising the tempo until we're about ready to leap on tables. Let's just try it as a love song. So after that, we sang Victory in Jesus every service that I was there. And we changed keys 8 times because that was the tradition. God wants to hear, because God is the great love of our life. The praise God wants to hear is love. Imagine then in the understanding, there was a Korean pastor there, Reverend Jong J.E. O-U-N-G. He struggled because his percent of English, he said, was about 30%. He preached a sermon in which he felt like he was ashamed because he couldn't communicate as well in English as he wanted to. And he preached on humility. It was like God had me sitting there, and God said, you've been looking, listen. And he said, I have struggled all these many months in his own study of understanding humility. And he said, after reading many scholars, the understanding of humility that has come to me is the word humility means without a mask. Here is the love of God. A God who comes to us without a mask. In God, there is nothing that's hidden. In God, there is no disguise. In God, there is nothing around the bend that's going to do disaster or harm to us. In God is one who can look us in the eyes and we see truth, not deceit. The humility of God is that God looks at us without a mask or a disguise and says, I love you. And when we look back to those words to remember, and we say to ourselves, pull me into the marrow of my bones, we understand that in humility and in the Hebrew concept of humility, that God has first pulled us into the marrow of God's bones, so that the work of God says to you, God who makes you a relative, God who does not speak to you without defining what role of love you have in the life of God, God who is not deceitful, has first pulled you into the marrow of God's bones, till God is not the same, because God has taken you in a transformative way inside the presence of God. Does that make sense? What God asks us to do is what God has already done. Monty Roberts, we often call him the horse whisperer. Monty Roberts was the son of a rancher. Monty had been a college football player and for a while a pro football player. But when he was young, his father, who was an alcoholic, he would take horses and he would break them. What a terrible word. He would take horses and he would break them. He would tie their feet together. He would keep it so the horses couldn't stand. If the horses wouldn't do what he wanted, he beat the horses until the horses were practically senseless or frothing at the mouth. And literally, he broke the will of the horse. He also beat his wife and son. Monty would go out and he would look at wild mustangs. You can find his complete story. There's several wonderful books and a wonderful man to get to know. There is on the internet the word join up. Monty would sit with his welts watching the horses that were wild, and he would see that the way that they acted. He saw when they moved their ear, and then when they moved this ear. And when a new horse would come to join the herd, the others would stand back. And then finally, when they were accepting of the new horse, they would start a chewing motion with their mouth, kind of like a suckling motion. But over time, he observed 30 plus, many more probably by now, expressions that horses use to communicate, and he would see how they did that. He learned as a boy that he could take a wild mustang and gentle it. And when his father saw him doing that, his father beat him with chains and put him in the hospital. Years moved forward, and Monty became known as the man who could take abused horses and turn them around, with only one exception. When they were getting ready to shoot horses because of psychosis or behavior, Monty would come. Queen Elizabeth invited him to England, and when he was there, they brought to him some of the worst horses in Britain and Ireland. And they would laugh at him and his ideas. But in 7 minutes, he would take the most abused horse, and the horse would experience him with join up. And quickly within these 2 minutes, Monty will come into a circular pen, not a pen with corners, not a pen that looks like it's going to hurt anything. And he'll have a lead rope on the horse, but it won't be pulled tight, and he won't be pulling it tight in his hand. He'll let it drag the ground. The horse will run in circles around Monty Roberts. It'll keep running because it's afraid. And Monty will say, if you're afraid, then just keep running. If you're afraid of me, then please keep running and run the circle, and the horse will keep running until it's tired. And then it will stop, and then it will pick up, and it will run again, and it will keep on running. And Monty just lets it run, and he talks to it in a nice, gentle voice. And then it gets to the point where Monty picks up the rope and he holds it in his hand, but he doesn't pull it tight and he doesn't hit the horse with it. And then Monty will turn his back to the horse as if to say, if you need to run, run. It's okay. I'm here. I'm not going to hit you. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to abuse you. I'm here. You don't need to worry about my face. I'm going to turn my back to you. And he will stand there. And then the horse does what's called join up, what they do in a herd. He'll walk up behind Monty Roberts, and he or she will put their muzzle on his shoulder and lay their head on his shoulder. And from that moment, Monty Roberts can ride the horse. They can walk together. They have an experience that will never be broken because it is both a spiritual and an emotional experience. Monty Roberts, who is not a person of faith, one day when we were out working with Native children in Montana, Monty Roberts said, if I were to be a Christian, this would be my understanding of God. God says, come in where I am. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to hit you. I'm not going to scream at you or call you names that are derogatory. I'm here because I want to be here with you. And at times we feel like we have to pull back and run away, and God says, that's okay. I'm still here. And if you need to run around the inside, I'm not going to pull this rope. You stay. And you run until you're tired. I'm here. Are you afraid of my face? The unmasked God? Are you afraid of my face? Is that what's bothering you? Let me turn my back. Let me show you that I trust you, whether or not you trust me. And Monty says, is not God asking us to join up? And when we are weary from running away, the God who invites us, the God who makes us a relative, the God who first altered the DNA of God by pulling us into the marrow of God's bones, says to us, we're family. Brothers and sisters, my grandparents, my cousins, my children, we are the people who have joined up with God. And because of that, we can join up with the world around us in changing ways. Mitakuyo yos. Taishne me kaos peshti. May God fill you from the inside out until you bubble over. Amen.